Hello and welcome to our lesson of Power of a Power Property, a more advanced look. First of all, let's talk definitions. The power of a power means that you raise the base, and the base is the big number, and the exponent, both of them together, and you're going to raise it to an entirely new exponent. So if we say the negative quantity 5, which we have right there, squared, there's your squared, raised to the fourth power, it looks like that. But hang on, when we say quantity, what does that really mean? It means that the entire expression before the second set of exponents, or parentheses. For here, when we said the negative quantity, they wanted us to write negative, and the word quantity means you're throwing down a parenthesis. They said negative quantity 5 squared, raised, and the minute they said raised, that means we're closing the second set of parentheses. Raised up to the fourth power. So if you have quantity, it's indicated by a set of parentheses around the 5 squared. We're going to deal with that negative outside the parentheses at the very end of the calculation. Now, if you see that, remember you have to follow the PEMDAS rules, and PEMDAS says that you do parentheses first. So everything inside that parentheses, which is 4 squared. Don't worry about the negative until the very end. Just keep writing them down. So we're looking at 4 squared. 4 times 4 is 16. And they want that entire quantity raised to the third power. So right here, everything inside the parentheses, which was the 16. Recopy that negative sign to the third power. Now we're going to deal with that outside exponent, which really means we're going to take negative, leave it on the outside, 16 to the third power, so it's 16 times 16 times 16. Once you get your final answer, then you deal with that negative. So let's take a look. That negative outside indicates that you flipped the sign of your answer. So if you have a positive answer, let's say your answer is 52, and it's got a negative sitting outside, that means that the positive 52 switches signs to a negative 52. On our last problem, when we took 16 to the third power, it was 4,096. So we had 16 raised to the third power, which is 4,096, with that negative sitting outside. And PEMDAS says once you do parentheses and exponents, you have to multiply. So technically, this negative sitting outside the parentheses means to multiply it. So you're multiplying a negative times a positive, which turns it negative. So your final answer is going to be 4,096. In other words, we just flipped the sign. Let's try a couple examples. So here, PEMDAS says we have to deal with the inside first, the parentheses. So we're dealing with the 4 squared. Keep that negative on the outside. 4 squared is 16, and we're going to cube it. This should look pretty familiar. Next, ignore the negative to the very end, and you're going to go ahead and multiply 16 by itself 3 times in a row. And we said that was 4,096. That negative sign still comes down, and we've got 4,096. This is a positive number, and this negative on the outside tells us to go ahead and flip the sign. So instead of positive, your answer needs to be negative 4,096, just like we did on the last problem. Now let's look at the second one. PEMDAS says we have to deal with all that stuff inside first. This time, the negative is directly attached to the 5. So when you take it to the fourth power, that means that the outside negative is still there. But now you're going to take the negative 5 4 times in a row. So you're going to take negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. And when you do that, once you get all that done, you're going to square it. Negative 5 4 times in a row is actually going to be 625. So we still have that negative sign out there. We have 625, and then we're going to square it. How did I know I had a positive 625? Because if you take a negative times a negative, you get a positive. A positive times a negative is a negative, and a negative times another negative ends up being a positive. Now you have that negative still sitting on the outside. It was this guy right there. And you've got your 625, and they want you to square 625. Do that first, then deal with your negative. That negative still on the outside. When you square 625, you're going to get 390,625. But we're not done because we still have to deal with that negative right there. So let's go up here. You've got negative, and then it's being multiplied by the inside positive number, which pretty much means flip the sign of the inside parentheses. So it's going to be a negative 390,625. That's going to be your final answer right there. Let's take a look at a couple more. Okay, what if you have a fraction? Big deal. Works the same as normal. You have 1/2 raised to the third power. Do the parentheses first. So they're asking you to take 1/2 and multiply it 3 times in a row. When you multiply fractions, you just multiply straight across. So you multiply all your numerators first. So 1 times 1 times 1 is still 1. And then you're going to take 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 2 is 8. We did everything inside the parentheses, and now we still have to raise it to the 4th power, which means you're going to take 1/8 and multiply it 4 times in a row. So you're going to take 1/8 and multiply it by itself 4 times in a row. And remember, when you're dealing with multiplication of fractions, it's straight across. So you have 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, which is always 1. And then you have 8 to the 4th. And if you raise 8 to the 4th, you're going to get 4,096. That's a big number for a denominator, but if you look at the entire fraction, keep in mind you're only taking one little piece out of 4,096 pieces, so this is a very teeny tiny number. All right, now we're going to look at the last one. Here we have a -2 raised to the third power, so we got to deal with the parentheses first. So they're asking us, just recopy the outside stuff, to take -2 and to multiply it by itself 3 times in a row. So if you're taking negative times negative, it's a positive. Positive times negative, you're going to get a negative answer. So that negative on the outside is still there. Now you have a negative inside number. There's that 5th that we deal with later. 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 2 is 8. All right, now we're still dealing with that negative outside the parentheses for the final thing, so don't worry about it yet. Now we're focused on taking -8 and raising it up to the 5th power. So we're going to take -8 and multiply it by itself 5 times in a row. So you're going to have -8 5 times in a row. I bet we're going to get a really big number. Now, if you have a negative times a negative, you get a positive. If you have a positive times a negative, you get a negative. A negative times a negative is a positive. And then a positive times a negative is a negative. An easy way to remember all this and not have to worry about that, anytime your exponent is odd and you have a negative number, it's still going to be negative in the end. So we're going to have a negative still on the outside. This guy right there, he's from there. And then when we took our -8 and raised it 5 times in a row, we're going to get a negative number, and it's going to be 32,768. But we're not done, because we still have to deal with this negative on the outside. Remember, this thing says flip the sign of your inside number. Since our inside number is already negative, we're going to change the sign. It goes positive. So our final answer down here is 32,000 positive 768. Right there. Remember, when there's a set of parentheses within an expression or equation, you have to calculate inside the parentheses first. That's what PEMDAS tells us. Parentheses comes first. And once you've raised that base, the big number, to the power inside of the parentheses, then you deal with that outside exponent. Any negatives that are sitting outside of the parentheses that you're dealing with just mean flip the sign of your final answer. So remember, we had that 4,096, and if we're going to say it's a flip sign, you take the negative and you change it positive. So your final answer would be a positive 4,096, and that's why that works. And that's it for our lesson on power of a power, a more advanced look.